Okay, we have a very special speaker in the room, and I would like to go ahead and introduce him. His name is Seth Andrews. He is a former religious radio host. I'm sure he'll speak about that. And in his book, Deconverted, he talks about the many years of doubt that he went through before deciding to join our ranks as unbelievers. And he is now host of The Thinking Atheist, as well as writing a book, Deconverted, which I highly recommend. So, Mr. Andrews, I will turn the mic over to you.
It is a pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear the sound of my voice? I switched out a sound card this morning, so I want to make sure that everybody can hear me. Yeah? Good. Very quickly, I'd like to sort of introduce myself and give you a very short synopsis of my story, and then I'm all yours. I welcome any questions or comments or challenges that you have. I was raised in a devoutly Christian home in Oklahoma, which is in the buckle of the Bible Belt. My parents are theologian-level believers, hardcore. My mother wrote a Greek New Testament study guide. They honeymooned in the Holy Lands. This tells you how serious they were. And when I was in third grade, I remember coming home and I told my mother and father about all these amazing things I was learning in school, public school, about Neanderthal man and the stuff that wasn't in the Bible. And it didn't take them long before they plucked all the children up, all the ones still living at home anyway, and they plucked us all up and they dropped us over here in a private Christian school where everybody everywhere agreed with the words of Scripture. There was no challenge whatsoever. Jesus is true, the Bible is true, the book of Genesis is true, absolutely. In fact, we had Bible classes, we learned Bible verses, we had Wednesday chapel services, like church services in your school. And from fourth grade through my senior year, I was immersed in private Christian education. I was a spokesperson for Youth for Christ when I was in ninth grade. And I became a Christian broadcaster. I was always a pretty good communicator. And I had a pretty good voice, so I got a job in Christian radio in 1990, and I spent a dozen years as a Christian broadcaster. 10 of those years was for one of the top Christian radio stations in the country, KXOJ 100.9 FM. And I was all in. I was just a true believer. And it never once occurred to me to challenge what the truth was. I had started with the answer. I didn't need to ask any more questions. The Bible is true, Jesus is true, Yahweh is true, all the other faiths are false faiths. And atheists, well, don't even get me started on those people. And, it's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts over a period of time. I began to see that much of what we had been taught from the Scriptures and heard from the pulpit simply didn't wash. It just didn't make any sense. And so I finally, at the age of 37, started to ask some really hard questions. I finally got sick and tired of opting out of the discussion. I decided, look, let's figure this one out. And the more I began to ask the experts, quote unquote, the experts, and the more I heard their defenses of things like human beings who lived almost 1,000 years in the Bronze Age, and talking donkeys, and supermen who gain super strength based on the length of their hair, and demon-infested pigs, levitation, sea monsters, an origin story of planet Earth that included a space wizard and a dirt man and a rib woman and a talking snake, all of these things. The more I heard the equivocations, a great example was Noah's flood. And I always like to start with the Noah's Ark story, because if the Bible is God's perfect, divinely inspired, and inerrant word of God, it's perfect. Everything in there is true. Well, all you have to do is show one inconsistency, one contradiction, or something that just fails the logic, reason, science, or history test. And you see, well, wait a minute, if that one crack can crumble the entire foundation. So you open up the Noah's Ark story. Well, wait a minute, a guy who lived 600 years in a time when the average lifespan was 50, hears God's voice because God, who saw in advance, well before the creation of the world, remember, he's beyond time, he's omniscient, he knows everything. So he realized that his plan was going to fail. He would have to violently drown everybody and start over, and yet he continued with the plan anyway. And he didn't just vaporize the non-believers and the wicked. I mean, animals and the unborn and all plant life. It was just crazy. A huge, unbelievable, barbaric waste is what the flood is. You got a guy who's 600 years old who builds a football stadium-sized boat with a single window, filled with everything from camels to penguins, which somehow walked 8,000 miles to survive in the desert of the Middle East. And these guys are cruising along, and the entire world is flooded. You know, one of the my favorite parts of the Noah story has to do with Noah when he sends the dove out to go find land, which doesn't make sense on two levels. Number one, it's why would Noah need to send a dove out to find land if he and God were on speaking terms before? He and God were chatting it up. God told him even the specific dimensions of the boat, the materials to be used, how to set everything up. And then at the end of the story, he's having to send a bird out to go do some recon to try to find out where the land is. The second thing is what difference would it make? You know, the ark didn't have a sail, and it didn't have a motor, and it didn't have a rudder. It was just adrift. So if they had seen land and they were 100 yards from it, they would have drifted right on by anyway. You know, the story makes no sense. On top of all that, the ark lands, 8 people commit incest to repopulate the earth and create the over 5,000 ethnic groups we see out there today. And the protagonist of that story spends his latter years naked and drunk. Now, you examine this story through the lens of objectivity, and you see how unbelievably ridiculous it is. And so that was one of the stories I would ask people. Hey, you know, tell me, how did this actually happen? I asked someone about the floodwaters covering the tallest peaks of the earth. Let's say, I don't know, Mount Everest. Now, the water would have completely frozen at that altitude. And the response I got back from an expert was, Mount Everest didn't exist at that time, meaning it had just sprouted up out of the earth over the last few thousand years. You hear enough of those type of equivocations and weird, incongruous sort of responses, and you start to realize, wait a minute, Houston, we have a problem. And so I did about a year and a half of just nonstop digging, and at the end of the journey in 2008, I said the word atheist for the first time. Being completely alone in this part of the world, I felt alone anyway, I decided to create an online community called The Thinking Atheist. And I am not the Thinking Atheist. Some people say, hey, Seth Andrews, quote unquote, the Thinking Atheist will be speaking or joining us. Thinking Atheist is an icon. It is an idea. It is an encouragement that we should all be thinking. I mean, those of us who come from the faith, we know exactly what it's like when they say, hey, you're thinking too much. Take it on faith. Go with your heart, go with your gut. And I decided that that's a horrible way to pattern one's life. I think we should all be reasoning creatures. We should all have mind engaged, have the brain in motion. We should all be encouraged to think, and that's what the website does. Question everything and start thinking. And the website has exploded. We've got 150,000 unique visitors a month. We do a weekly radio podcast on Blog Talk Radio, which started pretty small in 2010. We are on track to hit what looks to be about 2 million downloads in the month of March. I think we were 1.8 for February, which was a short month. So the show is being listened to by believers and non-believers alike who are sort of part of the conversation. And that's essentially what I am. I'm not an ex-pastor. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a guy who crawled his way out of a leadership position at a Christian radio station and was a former believer. I'm a storyteller and encourager. I just want to encourage people that it's okay to speak in your own voice. It's okay to be you. You don't have to inherit a worldview from someone else. You don't have to be emotionally blackmailed or guilt-tripped into living somebody else's way. You have this life. You have your voice. You can carve your path. It's okay. And it's not up to you to keep everybody else on planet Earth happy. And that's been my mantra here over the past several years, especially over the last 6 months as I've been speaking all around the country. I just encourage people. You don't owe it to other people to make them comfortable. You have earned the right to live a truthful life, whatever that means. And if other people don't understand, it says more about them than it says about you. So anyway, that's my story in a nutshell, and I'm at your disposal. I'm not exactly sure how the format works in this particular room, so I'll defer to the moderators. But if someone has a question or comment they'd like to toss out, I'm at your disposal.
Okay, thank you. We will take one question at a time. That was very well said, by the way. Thank you very much for your introduction.
Okay, I'm from India, and my grandfather was an atheist. My father was an atheist. I'm also an atheist. And though we are atheists, we are Hindus because Hinduism allows a lack of belief in God. My question to Seth is this. I have seen a lot of atheists who have their parents who were like fundis or believers in a very strong way. And I also know certain believers like Nephilim who said he was an atheist until he was 40 years old or something like that. And one sudden day, he had a calling or something, and then he goes to the church and becomes a believer. So my question to you is, you seem to be an atheist only because you didn't like that what is there in the Bible. You didn't like the story given in the Bible per se. You are not even talking about whether there is a God, a divine entity or not. You are saying whatever is in the Bible is nonsense, and that's why you are an atheist. So did you try to see whether there is any other kind of God out there, or whether the reason your parents were into these beliefs and stuff caused you to become an atheist, something like you wanted to rebellion against it or something like that. Mike is free.
Well, I heard a series of questions in there. Let me see if I can keep up with them. I did vet the other religions. After I came out of Christianity, it was obviously the next step. Well, does God exist? And upon searching other religions, I discovered that they were much like ordering Mexican food. If you walk into a Mexican restaurant and you say, look, what are you hungry for? Well, I'd like a taco. What's in a taco? Well, there's a tortilla, meat, cheese, lettuce, tomato. No, you know what? I think I'll have a tostito or whatever, tortilla something, a tostada. What's on a tostada? Well, there's a tortilla, meat, cheese, lettuce, tomato. Okay, I think I'll have a burrito. What's in that? It's a tortilla, beef, cheese, lettuce, tomato. It was the same ingredients, just served up in different ways. These religions have a holy book, they have a deity, they have a paradise, they have a pain, they have a mantra, they have temples, they have all of these guidelines for living. And they essentially were sort of variations on the same kind of stuff. It's the same reason I think I agree with Daniel Dennett that the basic tenets of all religions should be taught in even elementary school, not as truth, but here are the basic major religions of the world. Here's what they believe. I think even school children, if they were to see these side by side, would see the similarities. And if you look around us, you don't see supernatural things. You see a natural world governed by natural laws. And even the people who invoke God, well, they operate in a world as if there was no God. Why in the world would a believer in a divine protector ever click a seatbelt or load a handgun or lock a door? Why would anyone ever have health insurance if the divine creator of the universe was your parent and advocate? And you've got it made. You find out that most believers don't expect their God to do anything God-like. They speak the language of God, but they live as if they're on their own. And I found that was extremely telling. And as far as did I rebel against my mother and father? Well, I wasn't out to rebel at the age of 30, whatever. I might buy that if I was 15. But I was just dissatisfied. I was dissatisfied with these pat answers that were being spoon-fed, and I was irritated that I was told that I was the problem for asking questions and demanding legitimate and reasonable answers. Oh, Seth, you're a problem here. I was treated like I was broken, like I was an agent of Satan. I was tainted in some way. I was discriminated against personally and professionally. For what? For asking legitimate questions. A hugely telling thing. When you walk into someone who has what they consider to be a solid worldview, and all it takes is a question to get them to shut you down and shut you out of their lives and potentially bring specific consequences, be it personally or professionally. What kind of ideology is so weak that it can't stand up to a question? Mic is free.
Okay, go ahead, Human Evolution. I think you're next. If you have a question, mic is free.
Yeah, I just want to say, Seth, that was a great story. And when you were on the mic, it made me think of something. I'll try to load my comments or try to make it short. In the idea, at the time you were a Christian, the thing was, as you said, you researched, you started researching the Bible and started looking outside of the Bible. That made you become skeptical, which is really good. But here's the idea. How do you explain, like, for example, people like Nephilim? And I kind of can answer my own question, but I'd like to hear your views on it. Of people, like, for example, that are capable of using critical thinking on a daily basis. Like, for example, I knew a programmer who knew 7 programming languages, but he believed the world was less than 10,000 years old. For example, how can people, for example, use deductive reasoning capabilities? It's a phenomenon called compartmental logic. How can people be rational in one standpoint, but believe like Noah lived over 900 years old?
Okay, I'm guessing I'm up. I just saw my name at the top of the queue. How do otherwise intelligent people or people who use rationality in other parts of their lives, how do they accept such crazy and ridiculous stuff? It's a hugely interesting question. I had Michael Shermer of Skeptic Magazine on the radio on a couple of occasions, and we talked about that. And I think the reasons people come to irrational beliefs are as complex as the people themselves. I think some people are simply products of a religious culture. Everybody around them talks the language of that religion. There's a church on every corner. There's no one there who disagrees with it. So for them, there's no reasons. For some others, it might be about comfort. The idea of living in a deity-free world scares them, so they choose not to challenge whether or not there is a God. They choose not to go any further into the conversation. And then Shermer and others have done work on what Shermer calls patternicity. Quite often you'll find people who are hugely intelligent, but you'll find that actually their intelligence is one of the reasons they are able to see patterns where perhaps there are none. I mean, they are so good at putting puzzle pieces together that they can actually sort of overcompensate and put them together where there is no puzzle in the first place, where they'll see design where there is no design to begin with. You'll find people with PhDs who are hugely intelligent and who are very well versed and very rational in every other part of their lives. But as the brain is very modular, they can take this irrational belief, right, the belief in wizards and curses and spells and Xanadu in the sky, a hidden happy heaven and mansions and all that type of stuff. And they can put that over here in their little irrational thing, and it's protected. It's absolutely unchallenged. So, I've seen the studies that say that the atheist is more intelligent than the theist, and we can debate. That's a whole other show. I've decided that even if it was true, it's not what I want to live with. It's not what I want to lead with in a conversation. I think that quite often we need to see the reasons that people believe in a deity are hugely complex, quite often born of family and culture. And Dr. Peter Boghossian talks about delivering micro-inoculations to the faith virus, our living rational lives and asking rational questions, compassionately, responsibly, respectively, but asking those questions, delivering these micro-inoculations of rationality into the lives of people who are in some ways living irrationally. That's a healthy thing. They may not think it's healthy, but I think that's part of how we start to change the tide.
Okay, I believe the next person in line. I'm sorry if I bounce you off the mic. Go ahead, Herb.
Olivia, you get me every time. I think I wait a little bit thinking, like, is the admin going to grab the microphone? And then I didn't hear anything, and I go hit the button, and boom, there's the admin. I wanted to ask a question. I don't know, it's a little odd for me. I understand he's a guest speaker, but it's a little off for me because, I don't know, it's odd for me to be in a position to have somebody express all their feelings and their story and then jump to ask them just because they feel that. I wanted to know, he made a comment earlier, is it Seth, about how, the faith isn't much if you can't stand up to questioning. And that, there was, negative connotations against you. If I remember this right, I was a little lost. About you, questioning the faith with your family, that you weren't supposed to do that. You're supposed to kowtow and go along and just, not question anything. And that, when you made the comment to the effect of whether or not, that's reasonable, and if a faith is really, genuine, if they can't stand up to questioning, what's the difference to you if, say, someone has a family that's atheist and then they come home and they start talking of God? Do you think that there's significantly anything different in that situation where they might feel persecuted by their own family members, or that the negative connotations are any different, or that it's not, as an atheist, any worse for you to question your child if they come home and say, hey, I have faith, I believe? And I did have another question, but I don't want to hog the mic, and I don't remember what is off the hand because I was up here. So anyways, your mic.
Well, I have no doubt it would be difficult for a non-believing mother and father to have a child come back and say, I believe in fairies. That would be difficult. I do think that a lot of non-believing mothers and fathers would handle it a little bit differently. I did a show with Dale McGowan, who has written a book called Raising Free Thinkers. We did a show called Secular Parenting. And it is not about teaching a child what to think, but about teaching a child how to think. Look, if you and I are going to give our children the opportunity to live truthful lives, and we don't want to be guilty of what the religious do with their children, right? Which is to say, this book is true, this deity is real, pray and expect heaven and fear hell and all these types of things. And it is absolute fact, and if you question it, we're going to freak out because we're terrified you're going to go to hell and you're being corrupted and attacked by the devil, that kind of thing. Well, if you're a free-thinking parent, you aren't telling your child, you should not believe in a God. What you do is you say to the child, I personally do not hold to a deity, and I'll tell you why. But I think you should explore non-belief, explore this religion, explore that religion, explore this philosophy, explore that philosophy, and you give them the tools for proper understanding. Encourage them to ask questions. Dale said it best, you can change your mind 1,000 times. Send them off, give them the tools, make sure they're protected so that they're not sort of cordoned off and hyper-targeted by some religious organization. Hey, look, we'd like you to come to an overnight lock-in so we can scare the crap out of you. That kind of thing. Make sure that you're there to sort of protect them from that. But you can't shield them from the world. Give them the tools to properly understand the world and allow them to ask the questions. And I'm convinced if you have properly given them the tools to do so, they will come back with a sort of a foundation of rationality. And instead of having it spoon-fed to them, they will have found it on their own, and therefore it will mean much, much more to them. Now, do I think atheists can be sort of discriminatory? Can they flip out? Can they overreact? Can they react poorly? Absolutely. We're human beings. And there have been people who ask me about, hey, thinking atheist, isn't that redundant? Aren't all atheists thinkers? Of course not. Of course not. Not everybody came to non-belief in a deity for a rational reason. And I've had emails from people who are atheists who also believe in, little green men, and they believe that George Bush was behind 9/11. They believe, they talk to the dead. It is not being a non-believer in a deity doesn't necessarily mean anything else about you. The most important thing is, did you come to your non-belief through rational reasons? And that's usually the difference. But ultimately, what I tell people is it's not about training a child about what to think. It's about giving them the tools on how to think so they can properly understand the world, live a curious, wonderful life, And the voice that they're able to speak in when they find those answers is their own. Mic is free.
Mr. Andrews, my question is, how can you say that all religions are pretty much the same ingredients presented in a different way whenever you have religions like Buddhism that really aren't about pleasing a deity, or you have religions like paganism that really aren't scripture based and don't claim any kind of like divine revelation for their beliefs, just like more personal knowledge. How can you claim that all religions are like the same ingredients presented in a different way? I'd be interested to hear that explanation. Thank you.
No, there's no apology necessary at all. Well, I think I said, and if I didn't, I meant to say the major religions of the world. I mean, if you look at the major religions of the world, they do fit that template. And you're going to find variations of that. And you're going to find, I mean, there are thousands upon thousands of deities that have been sort of posited in the history of humankind. Of course, there's going to be a huge buffet of different types of religious belief out there. If it doesn't hold to a deity, and there's a large debate about whether Buddhism is or is not a religion. I know a lot of atheists who are sort of Buddhists, and they don't hold to a deity of any kind. Well, if you don't hold to a deity or the supernatural, but instead is more of a philosophy for living, then I would say in that context, it is not a religion. It would not be considered as part of that experiment. And if you do hold to a supernatural plane, well, then that's something else. By the way, everybody, call me Seth. Mr. Andrews, very kind of you. It makes me feel 70 years old. Just call me Seth. We're all casual. We're all having a beer. Okay. So I don't understand what the caller before had said, something about being disagreeing with how the non-believer was automatically, or the atheist or the agnostic was automatically. Wait, a non-believer was automatically called atheist or agnostic. Well, look, atheist means non-theist. You simply do not believe in a God. Yeah, well, look, I'm not an atheist. I just don't believe in any gods. Well, that sentence doesn't make any sense. If you don't hold to any gods or deities or whatever, you are a non-theist. You are an atheist. And I just wanted to clear that up. Mike is free.
Seth, I want to ask this question. I'm kind of asking the same question that the original question asker asked, Ocean of Notion, because I don't think you quite understood what he was asking. He did ask you, so you're rejecting the idea of God based upon the Bible, and then you went on to talk about how you looked at other religions as well. And I understand that, and I agree with your reasoning for that. But I am curious, I mean, the concept of God, I think, can be, I think it's beyond what organized religion would have us believe it to be. What I mean by that is theism in of itself, I would not personally consider to be a religion. So even if Christianity and Islam and Hinduism and all these different religions are just complete and utter BS, there could be perhaps some kind of a God in the sense that there's like a sentient creator of the universe. So I guess my question is this: what would have you rule out and be an atheist in regards to just that, the idea that maybe there is some kind of, like, why do you reject that concept outside of, organized religion, which you and I think most of the people in here could probably agree is a bunch of BS. But, what is there beyond that? So like, yeah, that's BS, but, what makes you reject the very idea of there being a sentient creator of the universe? Your mic.
Well, I get this question often in different forms. One will be, well, where did everything come from? Or are you saying that you have disproven God? Or I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. It's not a religion, but it's a relationship. It's those types of things or variations. And I understand, I think, where you're going with it. Look, why would you rule out that there was some being out there that spun the cosmos into existence and is responsible for the complexity that we see today? Well, there's a misconception that someone who is an atheist says, I can prove there is no God. That's just not the case. It's not even a scientifically tenable statement. We say we do not believe there is a God. We don't hold to a deity because we simply see no evidence for a deity to exist. If you look at our universe, do we know what caused the singularity that spun the universe into existence 13.7 billion years ago? No, we don't. But science is willing to say, no, we don't know yet. But does that mean it's tenable for someone to paint a God character in there because, hey, that would be convenient, right? Well, it was a big thing and it was sure complex and it's well beyond us. It must have been God. Well, that's just a cheat. It's not being honest about the answer to the question. Um, if you look at the complexity that we see and the beauty in our world, I did a video called Intelligent Design, where we sort of talked about those people who look up at a beautiful rainbow or a mountain vista, or the birth of a beautiful child, or the complexity of a snowflake. And the complexity is so overwhelming that it is simply, it's just absolute truth to them that there was a designer, a planner out there that put it together. And I said, fine, if we're going to look at that, then let's look at design honestly. Let's look at all of the things in this world that can kill us. AIDS and the influenza virus, and let's look at birth defects and stillborn babies, and let's look at tectonic plates and tsunamis that kill 250,000 people in a day. Let's look at the insects that burrow into the head of another insect to plant their eggs so that the larvae can eat their way out of a live host. Let's look at carnivorous animals tearing each other to pieces. Let's look at all the pain. Let's look at the fact that the vast majority of all life on this planet has gone extinct, which is hugely wasteful. If this is a finely tuned world and universe, then your deity is pretty wasteful and quite possibly incompetent. And ultimately, all of this stuff works without the idea of a deity. We look at our world and universe, and this stuff doesn't require a God to make sense. And while there are many questions we're seeking the answer to, just as we used to think that epileptic attacks, epileptic seizures were demonic possession back in the infancy of our species, now we understand what it is. Where we used to think disease was a curse upon someone, now we understand germ theory. We used to look up at the stars and think they were just pinholes in the sky. Well, now we understand more about the cosmos and what they are. The more we understand, the more the idea of God simply becomes obsolete. And so I don't hold to a deity simply because there is no need for a deity. It's not required. And the more we understand, the more we learn about the world and universe, the more that becomes even more the truth. Mike is free.
Yeah, hi Seth. Good to meet you. I like your philosophies. They sound pretty good. At the same time, I'm just going to ask this question, but you've answered most of the questions that I've had. I mean, I had really basically to ask was that, have you studied science of mind? You sound like you've, I've gone through just about everything. Have you studied anything metaphysical and science of mind and still come to that same conclusion that you've got? It sounds pretty, well, you've gone through a lot of stuff. I'm just wondering if you've gone through those yet. That's my question.
Well, let me make sure I get what you're asking me. If you're talking about how do we understand existence, that type of thing, the nature of space and time, and it's easy to sort of skip from metaphysics into sort of this Deepak Chopra Wooville. It's easy for people to sort of use that as a springboard to boom. I myself just have found the natural argument, the arguments based in the natural world, the ones that are the most satisfying for me. And so, yeah, I mean, I've explored. It's funny being in the arena of debate. We don't do a ton of debate on the social media pages, but I get correspondence and often will engage with people who send me emails and correspondence, and each one has a proof of God or a challenge, or many of them are, pretty emphatic. And you have a chance to have a lot of these conversations. And when something new comes up, you explore it. Hey, well, wait a minute. Let's look at that. Does that hold water? And for me, the metaphysical stuff didn't change my conviction that I was best off rejecting all ideas of faith, all ideas of sort of a spiritual membrane, because there simply is no evidence for one beyond the anecdotal or personal experience argument. And to base it in the evidence. Is it demonstrable? Is it supported by the evidence? Is it repeatable? Is it something that can be measured and peer reviewed? And if not, if it's merely somebody's word, somebody's personal experience, those types of things, I had to reject it. I hope that answers your question. Mike is free.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. I am a Muslim from United Kingdom. I normally say Robin Hood's country, and nowhere near Deepak Chopra. My question to you is, do you think God, to you personally, God doesn't exist because the books you read, they are proven wrong? Because the people you ask, they can't provide you answers? Because you cannot detect God? Because there is misery in the world? Are these the proofs you have for non-existence of God? And second question is, did you ever look at yourself, studied yourself, that you may find answers within yourself for the existence of God? Because we as a human are more complex creation than the universe. There must be something that you must have looked at yourself, inner self, yourself, to either accept that there is a creator or no, there is nothing. So I hope you understand my question. Mike's yours.
Well, I reject the idea of a God because specific gods are easy to reject if you can read the holy books and you can see the science and you can hear the sort of the arguments given from the pulpits and the podiums from the preachers, all the platitudes that are tossed out by the fervent and faithful. And so you can look at things like the Christian God and see the Bible completely folding under scrutiny. Same with the Quran, so many other philosophies and ideologies and specific deities, right? So you can examine them and say, well, look, there's just no proof that a God-man Jesus existed. He can be discounted. You can move past all these man-made gods. So then you're stuck with the larger, sort of the vague general God out there. The one, the creator, the first cause, the being, this sort of nebulous, all-encompassing creature out there. Well, okay, fine. If such a creature exists, there should be, and this creature was interested enough in us to warrant our allegiance and worship, then there should be evidence for him or it. A good reason to reject something is to find out that it is factually not accurate. And another good reason is because there simply is no evidence to hold to it. I mean, if you look around at our world and you see the guy who was a snake handling pastor in Kentucky last week, who was out there holding rattlesnakes and copperheads, and he was bitten for the 10th time, and he dies a horrible death in front of his wife and son. Well, look, even if he was hugely misguided, he was God's representative in God's house, surrounded by true blue believers. All right? So the fact that God does nothing and snake venom does what snake venom does, which is kill, and you look around and you go, wait a minute, there's no divine intervention. If you see people who are believers in a deity they're struck by malady of all shape and size. They live in a natural world. The fact that we look up and we don't detect a deity. We don't see, we don't hear. And you think about if there was a benevolent God who was genuinely worth our time and allegiance and love and worship, he, she, or it would have long since shown up, parted the curtain of the sky, and cleared up the mystery. Think about how you and I know our own parents. We know what they look like, what they sound like, what they smell like. We know their character, their nature. We know they'd give their very lives for us. Our divine Father, who's supposedly the more important parent, absolutely invisible. So invisible that in the year 2014, we continue to have discussions about whether or not he exists. That tells you how real this supposedly real God is. He's so real that we continue to have to ask each other and hold debates on the national stage as to whether or not he's actually out there. Well, that should tell you something. It also tells you something about people's ability to construct coping mechanisms in time of grief, or just answers and cloaks of comfort whenever things become too overwhelming and complex. They create a God, and they place him over here, and they say, this answer gives me comfort, and I will stick with it, and I will hold to it. But, I reject a God because, quite frankly, there's no evidence. And I'll tell you this, if evidence for a deity appears tomorrow, I'll be happy to examine the evidence. I mean, hard, demonstrable, peer-reviewable evidence. Not just, hey, I saw, I felt, I dreamed, but there's evidence. If that happens, I think any good scientist has to be prepared to reevaluate his or her position to make sure that they are living a truthful life. And if you ask a theist that, just like Ken Ham was asked at the Bill Nye debate, hey, is there anything that would ever cause you to change your mind? He was like, nah. Right? He starts with the answer. Therefore, he does not have to ask any more questions. Mike is free.
First of all, thank you for taking your time. And I know most of us are busy, and you're taking your time to talk to us and answer questions. So I appreciate that. I get to ask this a lot, and this is a question that's asked a lot in the room. So I'm going to take the guise of a theist as such and ask this question. What would make you change your mind? I guess the question is not so much would you change your mind, but what proof would you need? Because we're asked that a lot as an atheist or agnostic. People ask all the time, what proof would you require? So it's a pretty good question in the sense that it has multiple answers, obviously, and it would lead to personal experience. But I don't want to poison the well here, so I'll let you answer.
Well, I think an omnipotent deity could come up with innumerable ways to prove himself. I think the difference needs to be it's not someone giving you an anecdotal account. I think it has to be measurable. If we were to look at, well, I go back to the Christian Bible because that is my background, but it's true with any holy book. Let's say this was God's divinely inspired instruction book to humankind. If the Genesis story lined up with the dating of the earth and the dating of the universe and the position of the planets and the cosmos, and we found an ark, we found geological evidence of a global worldwide water catastrophe. If we were able to track down and measure all of the things that are presented and posited in Scripture, well, that would be something that we would definitely have to take into consideration as to whether or not this deity would actually lived or didn't live. If a God came and provided evidence, I don't think for an omnipotent deity, evidence is a problem. It should be the easiest thing to be able to take us, we who are insects, we who could barely understand the mind of God, to simplify it and to come down and provide proof, measurable, repeatable truth, documented truth, peer-reviewable truth, facts, evidence, something we can hang our hat on, something beyond some guy behind the pulpit telling us to believe and take it on faith. And whatever those facts are, I'll leave it up to the deity. I actually did a speech a while back where we actually said a prayer to Satan. People are always warning us about hell. And so one guy told me, I think you do believe in God, and I think you're afraid of hell. So if you really are an atheist, I think you should drop to your knees and invite Satan into your heart. And I was like, wait a minute. Well, I didn't invite him into my heart, but we did have a little conversation, and we had a prayer. Dear Satan, we invite you here. Look, I open myself as a vessel. You can't be Lord of my life, but look, prove yourself. If you prove yourself here, you will provide rescue for the hundreds of people in the audience today. Come on, bring it. Show me something demonstrable. Let's go. And you could have heard a pin drop after that. I got a big picture of Satan up on the PowerPoint, that type of thing. And of course, there's nothing. Look, this is the kind of stuff, if we'd read it in Harry Potter, we would immediately reject it as ridiculous fantasy. But if we grow up believing it as children and take it into our adulthood and teach our children, well, that's different. All of these crazy and fantastic stories, they make perfect sense, and we've taken it on faith. It must be true. Mike is free.
Okay. Yeah, it was a good discussion. I want to, just taking it from my position, I guess, I had a similar experiences to what you had in your life, Seth. I mean, I actually became an atheist, so I was probably about 12, 13 years old, and I was always skeptical of the Bible, even as a kid. But my question is, what about many believers that even are very devout Christians, but they're also very scientists? For example, like Ken Miller, I'm sure you're familiar with who he is. He's a molecular biologist that has made huge contributions to biology and specifically molecular biology. He's a devout Catholic. So from your perspective, would you give them sort of a pass in the sense? In other words, where does it sort of the line drawn of what you would say is where you would challenge somebody? So, like, for example, if Ken Miller were in your presence, would you challenge his faith? Or would you give him a pass because he is a devout scientist besides being devout to his faith? Go ahead, next on the mic.
Well, if I was to meet a molecular biologist, I would obviously challenge their belief in Scripture, but I couldn't speak to them on the level of molecular biology. I would honestly want to look at the larger picture of what do the whole of molecular biologists say in regard to his claims, that he believes in the Christian God. And I would like to see what science as a whole. I was talking to Lawrence Krauss and Dr. Jerry Coyne on different occasions. We were talking about this notion that science is all one big conspiracy to kill God, right? But the absolute truth is that scientists take great pride and often joy in peer reviewing each other, and they get famous by proving someone else wrong. They will look at someone else's work with a huge amount of scrutiny. Well, if you look at Ken Miller and you look at his claims, what do his claims say in the light of the whole of respected science and respected biologists out there? You'll find an anomaly everywhere. And you'll find irrationality everywhere, even among PhDs. I mean, a great example is Francis Collins from the Human Genome Project, right? He believes the Bible, despite the fact that he himself has said in his own book, which came out in 2007, he said that the Genesis account for the origin story of humankind doesn't wash. The Adam and Eve story can't be true. There would have to have been tens of thousands of people alive at that moment, right? So even he, a fundamentalist Christian, says evolution explains our origins, and yet he holds to the Bible, which tells you there's something else going on here besides science. There's something else going on here beside the facts. I would be happy to challenge Ken. I hear he's a great guy. I hear he's a great guy to hang with. He's great to be on stage with. I've heard wonderful things about him. I have no doubt. As far as his belief in Scripture, yeah, we could talk. If we wanted to talk biology, I would definitely have to defer to a trained biologist in the field to be able to address the specific claims he makes about this. Is it Stephen Meyer who talked about the signature in the cell? If you look at the cellular level, there is no doubt that there was a sort of a crafter, a designer. We have been blueprinted by a divine authority. Well, let's get the biologist in a room and let them hammer that out. Let's see, Mike is free.
So my question to you, right, so before rejecting religion and becoming an atheist, did you ever seek out any other form or study any other religion or even interpretation of the Bible within Christianity, other varieties of Christianity and interpretations of, let's say, the creationist account, for example, progressive creationism, theistic evolutionism within Christianity? So that's my question to you. And did you ever consider deism or?
Well, yeah. Once I decided that Christianity no longer provided satisfactory answers, the next point of sort of inquiry was, well, what about these other religions? You know, you look into, I mean, I looked at Islam, but honestly, there were so many similarities. You know, the Quran and the Bible have similarities and many, many differences, but you can see them on their face. You know, they've got a paradise, they've got a judgment, they've got Allah, they've got the Prophet, they've got, you know, the divinely inspired message from above, and a desire to go out and make converts and essentially make the entire world believe what they believe. Well, that sounds pretty familiar. And you know, you look at Judaism, and I looked at you know, Catholicism. I looked at the different. Look, being a product of a Christian home, I had an ex-Lutheran father, had a Pentecostal mother, and I went to a Baptist school. So we got the conservative and the sort of charismatic Assembly of God Pentecostal flavor and everything in between. And there are few things as much fun as watching people inside the Christian faith from different denominations chew each other to ribbons over the basic tenets of their faith. You know, put them in a room and ask them about the basics, right? For God is not the author of confusion. This is a pretty confusing dogma, is it not? And the Bible says, if the trumpet make an uncertain sound, who would heed the call? Well, it's an uncertain sound. They can't decide on whether or not they should immerse with baptism or sprinkle. They can't decide whether salvation's eternal or temporary. They can't decide if you can lose your salvation or you can't lose your salvation. They can't decide if you have to ask the Holy Spirit in separately after you ask Jesus into your heart, or if it happens automatically at the same time. These are basics. And so, yeah, I fully vetted the denominations within the Protestant Christian faith. Catholicism, I looked at the others, but honestly, even a cursory look reveals that these are interpretive dances to the very same song. And then if you spill out of those organized religions, well, now you're into all manner of spirituality and deism, which mostly come down to emotion, conditioned response, and anecdotal personal experience arguments, people who say they saw the white light, people who say they heard voices, they speak to the dead, all those types of things. Those anecdotal accounts don't help us in the arena of ideas those anecdotal accounts don't help us if we are seeking evidence. They're simply someone's opinion, perspective, point of view, and no matter how fervently they are asserted, you cannot take them to the bank, because for every person over here who is absolutely certain they heard the voice of Jesus, there's a guy over here who's absolutely certain he heard the voice of Muhammad, and there's someone over here who absolutely heard the voice of Elvis Presley. So if you're going to take anecdotal evidence at face value, you have to entertain everybody, everywhere, every time. And that is not how science is conducted, and I don't think that's how a worldview should be fashioned. Mike is free.
I'm actually glad that you just got to that point in the conversation, because it pertains to my question. I noticed when you were speaking, you're a very deft conversationalist and speaker. You know, I'll give you credit for that, and I'm not knocking you when I say it. But I noticed that something that you do during the conversation just left me curious, and I'm going to ask if it's possible that you don't, so when you're answering this question, because I want to know your personal opinion. I noticed that during the conversation, when people ask you about your beliefs, you have a habit of saying when you're relating to things when you were younger, I and how you feel specifically, but when they ask you specific questions about your beliefs and why you feel that way, you defer to we, almost as if somebody gave you information and you've indoctrinated that to yourself. And I'm going to assume maybe you're just thinking maybe we as an atheists, but I'd like to know your personal feelings, so that's why I posed that question, or why I brought this up before I posed my question. Seth, you made comment or reference earlier to the idea that if we gave children an opportunity to think for themselves, you were under the belief that they would come to a rational conclusion if we allowed them to be free thinkers. And you also made a comment to the effect that people who have a religious experience, or actually I think you said the word supernatural religious, you didn't really want to talk about it too much. You said something to the effect that like that's something else altogether. And I'm curious to know, having said those things, what do you personally believe of people who say those things? I understand you don't acknowledge them as tangible experiences, those who feel that they've had a religious or a supernatural experience. But what do you equate that to? Are you inferring in some way that it's a mental health problem? Are you inferring that they are not rational people? What are you inferring personally? Not your faith, but you as a person who's come to that conclusion. Your mic.
Well, I think it's fair, that you point out that I would use the word I or we in a response. I try to often stay away from the word you. You do this, you do that. I prefer to talk about I and the culture that I came from. I, my family, my schoolmates, my religious broadcasting friends. So when I say we, I'm not trying to lump everybody everywhere into the we response, but I think it has merit. We in the church, in the Protestant Christian church, used to do this. We believed that. We had and held this perspective. We waited for the second coming. We learned out of the book of Revelation. We did this. I think that has merit in its context, as long as you understand. I'm not trying to say everybody everywhere falls under the we umbrella. And understand also it's my attempt to make sure that I don't try to project on you, what you are, what you think, what you believe, those types of things. I'm not trying to paint you into a corner or sort of cram you into a cookie cutter. So I hope that is clear to everybody within the sound of my voice. Spiritualism is a tricky one because it is Baskin Robbins. It's 31 flavors. It is something different to everyone. And it's sort of a series, no matter where we go, I've found that they're the ever-moving goalposts. If you're able to demonstrate that a specific and organized religion is not based in fact or is not moral, for example, the Quran and the Bible, they're not moral books. The objective eye reveals that. So then people tend to step back. They'll step away from fundamentalism. They'll step away from a specific deity. They'll step away from a specific church or temple, and they'll say, I am spiritual. Well, fine. I can't do much with that. It's your assertion of being in touch with a spiritual plane. And unless it is something that can be demonstrated and measured, it simply doesn't do much for us in our quest for determining facts. What do I think of the people that hold to see, a spiritual plane, a spiritual membrane out there? Well, I think it's a number of different factors. Quite frankly, I think people have a desire to believe. I think people are very, very susceptible to the power of suggestion. I think some of it's brain chemistry. We did a show on the near-death experience, the NDE. People will be on the operating table and their heart will stop and they say, I saw a white light. I floated over the operating room and I heard the voices of the doctors and I floated back into my body and I came back to tell the tale. Or I saw God, or I visited hell. Who was the evangelist who used to talk about going to hell? He came back to warn everybody about it. Well, we were talking about the science of the human brain, hypoxia. We know the brain's deprived of oxygen. We talk about the nature of the human eye. When those types of things happen, you actually see a tunnel of white. You see a white light. You feel joy and pleasure. This is chemically. This is answered by brain chemistry, not necessarily by a spiritual membrane out there somewhere. I don't think less of spiritual people. My family and pretty much almost all of my immediate friends are spiritual people. They're religious people. We have a disagreement. They are like I was. They were born into a religious home. They're part of a hugely religious culture. It gives them comfort. I'm amazed at how few have asked me questions. I'm amazed at how few religious people or spiritual people come to me and say, hey, Seth, you're a smart guy. I'm curious about this atheism thing. You walked away from your faith, and I know you must have had your reasons. Let's have coffee and talk about it. Not in that pawing at me, fix me because I'm broken kind of a way, but a genuine, hey, let me examine what I'm about and make sure that it holds water. Nobody does that, right? Nobody wants to know. That tells you something, right? They've cordoned off their belief system. They cherish it. They've got it protected. It's behind barbed wire. They've circled the wagons, and they're not interested in genuine challenge. And often I think for many people it's about comfort. It gives them comfort to think when things go crazy in this world that there's something somewhere out there. It alleviates the fear of death, the idea that when you die, the the electrical activity in the body and the brain stops, and that's it. And you decompose, and all of the elements of your body sort of become parts of other things. That's scary to a lot of people. You won't be reunited with loved ones, so they construct the methods of coping with a crazy life and an inevitable death. And that is how I explain it. Mike is free.
Hi, Seth. It's really great that you stopped by. So I was listening to you talking about, I guess your mom was a Pentecostal and your father was, I forget now exactly, was he a Lutheran or something? I feel really lucky in that I was brought up by completely non-religious parents, and added to that, I didn't grow up anywhere near any sort of a Bible Belt or anything of that sort. So my main exposure to, the major religions was in school, right? In history class, we were taught about the major religions. So one of the most amazing things I found when I came onto the internet is coming across former believers, right? And I get to hear like their transitions from being believers to non-believers. And some of them, were actually former ministers and pastors and things like that. And I kind of heard a little bit of how I think you put it like, death by 1,000 knives and everything like that. One of the features that I find really interesting is in retrospect, when a former believer looks at their transition and everything like that, they will see in retrospect, almost it seems, this is where they can really be honest with themselves and see that they were hanging on desperately trying to rationalize it, desperately trying to prop up the faith, even though somewhere deep down they knew that, there's problems here. And I'm just wondering, did you find yourself, in the final analysis looking back and saying, you know what, yes, I was doing that at some deep down level, not only did I see problems in the theology and contradictions or something like that, but deep down, I knew at a gut level that, this was false, and maybe, things like the fear of hell or something like that were really forcing you to like kind of stick with this before you jettison it. And, did you find yourself coming out and still having like a fear of hell or something like that? And pass the mic.
Well, you don't choose what you believe. It's funny, people will sometimes say, when did you choose to be an atheist? And I'm like, well, look, you don't choose what you believe. I didn't wake up one day and say, today I choose to not believe in a deity. I simply put the puzzle pieces together and asked the questions and heard the answers and did the exploration and came to the conclusion that there's simply no evidence to support it. So no matter what I admitted out loud, I didn't believe. I may not have professed to be a non-believer, especially at first because I was afraid, but I was a non-believer. Sometimes people say, well, something must have happened to you. Some major event happened in your life that just rattled your cage and screwed you up. And I used to discount those. I used to blow those off and say that's not accurate. But the truth is, sometimes if you are complacent or comfortable or just insulated, it takes a major event to rattle your cage. Something comes along and blows fresh air through the cobwebs. Sometimes uncomfortably warm or cold air through the cobwebs. And you go, wait a minute. It shakes your foundation and you have to regain your footing. And you have to decide, is this foundation secure? And those major events I've discovered do have merit. When I was a believer, did I see problems with the theology? Not for 2 decades, I just bought it. Everybody around me spoke the language of the Bible and Jesus and God. Everybody around me. There was just no exception. It was just my normal. Mealtime prayers, normal. Memory verses at school, normal. Sunday church, normal. Praying for forgiveness when I had a bad thought, normal. Anticipating heaven, fearing hell, fearing Satan, normal. This is normal. And it is for millions. It is millions and millions of people because everyone around acts like them. But as I grew up and a few major events happened in my life, one was when I was in Christian radio, the death of a Christian recording artist who was horribly killed, and I had to go on live radio and explain to everyone how this was God's plan. God called him home, amen, And after 9/11, I began to see people who were invoking God in all manner, and I said, this doesn't even make sense. And those big things and a bunch of small things finally got me to asking questions. I was a true believer, man. And deep down, to my bones, I believed it was true. I didn't want to go to hell. That also kept me in check. And even after I said the word atheist out loud, I'd been so brainwashed as a child that it took me a while to get past that whole, hey, what if you're wrong? Man, if you screw this one up, you're going to burn forever. You don't want to be tortured, do you? It's Pascal's wager is what we call that. Not once at the time had it occurred to me that, wait a minute, why am I worshiping a deity? Why would I ever want to worship a deity that was the architect of the worst torture chamber ever conceived of by any being anywhere? It makes Hitler look like Mickey Mouse. The most unbelievable, agonizing torture imaginable. I would worship the architect of that? The guy who saw the damnation of billions before he actually created the world. Again, he can see through time. He knew billions would burn in agony, and he continued to do it anyway. He just, what the hell? And I decided, hell doesn't exist. It can't exist. Look, if hell exists, heaven cannot exist, okay? Because if my father and mother, who believe I'm hell-bound, they go to heaven, and they're going to live forever, and they're going to have mansions and pearly gates and doves and angel wings and Yanni music and all that stuff, right? How could they ever experience perfect, eternal bliss? How could that place exist if they knew that their cherished and beloved son was at that moment screaming and writhing in unimaginable agony? It can't exist. If there was a hell, there could not be a heaven. And that's one of the many arguments I've used to just walk away from the whole thing. Hope that answers your question. Mike is free.
Yeah, Seth, whenever I came in, you were answering a question and talking about the problem of evil. So the question I have for you is, if a deity isn't worthy of being a deity unless they're omnipotent and can take away all the suffering of the world, but they won't for whatever reason, how could you say that a deity isn't worthy to be called a deity if they're not omnipotent, etc., unless you had a concept of a deity in your mind that you were comparing them to, that you were working with? Do you acknowledge, Seth, that there's concepts of God that aren't omnipotent and such, and therefore wouldn't necessarily be malevolent just because they can't do something? And how would you say that they're not worthy to be called deities unless you were comparing them to some actual divinity concept in your mind? Yeah, but I'm done.
Well, I guess we could talk about the deities with limited powers. Go back to some mythological deities that maybe have a couple of really cool tools in the tool bag. But we're still talking about the supernatural. And the argument whether or not God exists for me is part of the argument. The other part is, and I hope this speaks to your question, is if that deity existed, would he, she, or it be worthy of my allegiance and worship? And I've answered the question no on both counts. I look around at the world around us, and I don't see any evidence. I just don't see it. Could something be out there? You know what? I've said before, I believe that the universe was created by a giant plush pink spider monkey suction cup to the back of one of Jupiter's moons. Prove it doesn't exist, people. Prove it's not there. And but just because you can't disprove it does not mean it's a reasonable way to live one's life, or it's really a viable solution in the grand scheme of things. So you look around, you say, is there evidence for a deity of any kind with omnipotent or even limited power? And two, if that deity exists, if the answer to the first one was yes, if that deity exists, would that deity be worthy of my allegiance and worship? And there's just been no evidence to support a yes answer on either question. Mic is open.
Okay, my question is simple. I will post it in text too. Atheists believe there never can be God in this reality we call the universe, or outside of it, supernatural, so it is not existing. Agnostics believe there can be God, but we are yet to realize it in a rational reality, so there is no evidence. Or perhaps it is outside our reality, so a God can exist without rational evidence. And believers think everything in this universe is evidence for God. So my question is, isn't agnostic position better, logical, and more balanced for the common person? By the way, I'm an atheist. I do not believe in God, and I do not seek divine interventions, even if there is a God. I say I will do the 50%, and I will do the other 50% also in my life. But that's my decision. But why should we go for atheism instead of agnostic or agnosticism? Isn't agnostics perhaps the better and logical and more balanced way of looking at the thing? Mic is free.
The chat room about how long you guys have me till 3:30 Central if you would like. It's totally up to you, or if everybody feels like we played it out, the room is all yours. You're not going to bruise my ego at all, trust me. Well, I think we may disagree a little bit on definitions. I don't subscribe to the notion that an atheist says there cannot be a God. I believe that people who are atheist, non-theist, do not hold to a God because they simply see no evidence. And there are some people I think out there who might say, there is no God. It's been completely disproven. But the majority of the atheists that I've come in contact with simply say, I just don't believe it. There's just no evidence for it, which happens to line up pretty much exactly with the agnostic position. Maybe the agnostic will say, well, it's hard to know. It's just hard to know. I don't see any evidence, but I don't know. Maybe it's a softer version of the atheist position. I don't get too hung up on the labels. There are a lot of arguments about atheist versus agnostic. Quite frankly, whatever floats your boat. Some people like agnostic because it's a little less freaky to the religious people in their community. But I don't get too hung up on the labels as to whether or not you are an atheist or an agnostic. I think honestly, if we're living truthful lives, we simply want to live truthful lives. We want to live evidence-based lives. I would rather live a hard truth than a happy fantasy. And I'm not prepared to hold to stories of magic wizards in space who created me to be the center of a universe filled with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of galaxies. And all of the stories that are being thrown at us by the theists and the deists and all these other people who talk about all these nebulous notions of God, quite frankly, there's just no evidence for it. And life is so much richer whenever you live it with a genuinely, honestly curious eye. Even if you realize that we are a speck upon a speck inside this vast universe, and that we're not going to find ourselves in a mansion in pearly gates with the family dog for all eternity singing praises to Jesus or whatever. We're not going to get the 72 virgins. We're not going to get all those crazy things. I think it makes this life even more amazing, more precious, more wonderful, to live an honest and truthful life. I honestly think it's a beautiful thing and it should be appreciated. Mike's free.
Okay, before I ask the question, I will point out that deism doesn't, or most deists do not appeal to emotion for their argument for God. I do want to point that out. If you want to, but at least I hadn't met one that has. Now, the question comes is, you keep talking about evidence and what have you, and peer-reviewed, yada, yada, yada. So my question has to do with epistemology. Exactly on what do you base your view of epistemology? Okay, how do you believe that human beings come to learn or receive knowledge? That would be my question with regard to you. And that actually does have a big impact on the theist-atheist discussion as well. So.
Well, you and I have a disagreement about deists. I think many deists, certainly not all, but I think many do appeal to emotion. And it's often a byproduct of the fact that they have removed themselves from a hard theist position, right? If they see the hard theist claims begin to crumble under their feet, and they drift out of fundamentalism into this sort of nebulous, well, there is something somewhere out there. And for many people, this is an emotional decision. This is an emotional sort of charge. I think there's something out there. All of this couldn't have just happened. Doesn't it give you comfort to think that something somewhere out there is in control? There's a lot of emotion in deism, certainly not everywhere, but you and I have a disagreement there. How do I think we come to learn and receive knowledge? Well, I mean, I think honestly it comes down to what we can test. You know, what we can, if we can conduct an experiment and we can repeat the experiment and we can see the results and repeat the results, if we can begin to deal in the concrete instead of just the abstract, I think these are where our answers are found. If you're measuring the age of the Earth and you're using all these different types of radiometric dating and you're able to replicate results, you're able to see that, yes, it does work. You can show it works. You can look at the fossil record and you can do what Bill Nye was speaking about. You can predict where the transitional species would be and what they might look like, and boom, it happens. You're able to use processes, hard concrete processes, to be able to properly understand our world, to be able to use the Hubble telescope to observe our universe. Now, there are some say that just by observing you've already tainted it. Well, perhaps. But I think, there are such things as facts. I mean, it's not an opinion that the universe is expanding. It's observable that the universe is expanding. It's not an opinion that, dinosaur fossils are 65 million years old or whatever, depending on the fossil. You can actually participate in a process, replicate that process, and measure the results. So it's not my opinion it's we can demonstrate. And I think that's the best tool for us to receive knowledge. Mike's free.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. I'm curious to know how you would answer to the argument that, well, religions can do good in the world. Religion gives believers comfort, and it gives certain people or believers courage to do good in the world, to fight for what's justice. Martin Luther King used God as his justification, um, including the Declaration of Independence. Uses God as justification for some type of natural rights and whatnot, and whether or not they're true or not, they can do some good in the world. So why should we burst that bubble? Basically, Mike is free.
Well, I agree with Sagan that if it can be destroyed by the evidence, it must be. To be able to say, I think we should embrace a fantasy because people who believe that fantasy often do nice things. It's not a tenable argument. There's nothing done by religion to benefit others in this world that can't be done outside of religion. And we used to take mission trips. We would go to a third world country. You would take food and clothing, and you would build shelters, and you would give them clean water and all those types of things. And they would do it, and they would talk about it in terms of, when Jesus was feeding the 5,000, he fed them physically so that he could then go feed them spiritually. And that's what missionaries do. They'll go into a place. They don't immediately drop off all the Bibles and start preaching. What they do is they meet the physical need first. But the end zone is that they're going after the soul. Well, there's no reason for someone to have to paint and sort of an altruistic deed or a humanistic deed or an act of compassion or sacrifice for another to benefit humanity. There's no reason you have to put that in the religious box. There are heinous organizations and cultures that have done all manner of evil things, who also did some good things throughout history. Would you defend them? Because, hey, they actually fed some hungry widows over here, and they actually built a school over here. Well, of course not. The religious sort of umbrella over it was a problem. It was actually a distraction. It was taking resources away from what should be just a genuine act of kindness, of compassion, of goodness from one to another. Does it give people comfort? Sure. Is that a reason that we should not ask difficult questions? Look, if you are comfortable in your faith, this isn't necessarily something to be admired. Sometimes to be made uncomfortable is the key to a truthful life. And many people who feel attacked, and they'll borrow the offense. If I go after their deity and I say, well, actually, the evidence shows that there was no such deity, and this story never happened, and this account is totally against all the history and the evidence and the science. This is bogus, this is bogus, this is bogus. I'm going after the theology and the ideology. People will borrow the offense, and they'll feel personally attacked, and they will be made uncomfortable. Sometimes discomfort is our key to sort of getting past the blinders, taking off the God glasses, to not looking through the stained glass, and to start to see perspectives beyond our own, to set us free. I was made uncomfortable by a video I saw by Christopher Hitchens debating Rabbi Shmuley Boteach. I watched him challenge God firsthand, and I was squirming in my seat. And it was a darn good thing it happened. It made me uncomfortable enough to start to find out, wait a minute, maybe there's more to this. Am I living truthfully? Is all the stuff I was taught and told and assumed, is that accurate? Being uncomfortable was actually my ticket to freedom. And if religion gives people courage and whatnot, it's totally understandable. It is explainable. I honestly think they are giving God the credit for what they are doing themselves. The courage and the fortitude and the determination and the goodwill that they draw internally. Well, they don't need to paint God into that scenario. They should give themselves much, much more credit. It's like people blessing a food. They're blessing a meal that God provided, right? Except that humans planted the food, harvested the food, prepared the food, and cleaned up the mess when the meal was over. Human beings did all the work. God got all the credit. I think we pull God out, eliminate the middleman, and give credit where credit is due, where it belongs. Last question. Mike is free.
Seth, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. You made me smile when you said universe is expanding. I wonder, when did science discover that? Because Quran said it 1400 years ago. I believe that there is revealed knowledge and acquired knowledge. And I am a believer. There are many things that are revealed knowledge. An origin of all knowledge, including acquired knowledge, I believe is God. My question to you, sir, is, let me explain a little bit of background. I used to be spiritual. I used to be in spiritualism very deep, many years. Reason I gave up, because I could tell what's going to happen tomorrow. And I've demonstrated it to many people, and it happened exactly.
I guess he's gone. Well, look, you can come here and pitch the Quran all you want, but it's the same book that says that sperm comes from the backbone. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you can come here and speak with all fervor, and you can be as convincing as you like, but we're talking about the facts. Sperm doesn't come from the backbone. And if you take a hard look at the Quran, as if you would look at the Bible or any other book like that, and you skip past the happy, clappy verses, you will see a book that is a hugely misogynistic and violent and barbaric and prehistoric and primitive book that must be rejected outright. Absolutely. So, I mean, you can come here and say, the Holy Quran is amazing and it's true and all those. Well, none of those things make it true. None of those things make it a Bible or a book or a Quran or a holy text that should be necessarily held to in any capacity whatsoever. Your conviction is not proof. And I would encourage you to take a harder look at the holy book that you hold so dear. Does that one count? Did you want me to do one more, guys? It's totally up to you. We done?
I found something that Seth said interesting earlier when we were talking about people who, or what your opinion is of people who feel that they have come to the determination that there is a God based on the idea that they've had some sort of, in your opinion, supernatural experience. You made a comment that you believe that people want to believe, and that I know you did go on to expound on that, and that you'd mentioned you believe that there were other reasons too that might explain it, such as health issues or things that happen in the brain due to chemicals. But later in another question, when you were justifying your own beliefs, you made a comment that you didn't believe that we actually get to choose whether or not we believe or what we believe in. That you didn't sit down and one day decide that you wanted to be an atheist. And I'm just wondering how you can justify that as an acceptance for you, but not for somebody who believes in that they've had a supernatural experience. How are they any different if we don't choose to believe? If those people truly believe that they've had that supernatural belief, wouldn't the argument be said that there was a reason or a legitimate cause behind it if it wasn't caused by something medical? I don't understand how you can justify your own beliefs with that, but then not somebody who's of a religious faith or order. Your mic.
Well, many people do want to believe. I don't think I said all people want to believe, but many people do. They find comfort in it, and therefore they are more apt to allow an uncritical view of a cherished belief system. I don't think you can choose to believe or not to believe. I mean, I largely believe that is true. But I also think you can create conditions where you allow yourself to sort of lazily accept, or for irrational reasons, accept nonsensical beliefs because it gives you comfort, because it's what you always have known. You know, and I felt, I saw, I heard, I tasted, I was there, trust me, it was real. It all sounds good when you say it out loud. But subjective human experience is not proof. Levin and Kramer did some great work as far as eyewitness testimony in court cases, and how unreliable it is to have people come in and take the stand and say, I just know it happened like this. Because perception and reality are quite often so very, very different. Measuring time and space and color and speed and the specific details of any circumstance. Well, how we perceive those and what they really are not always the same thing. And again, if we're going to put people in a room and we're going to all have them sort of give us their personal experiences of spirituality, they're going to hugely conflict. So who is telling the truth and who is not? Well, if we're in the arena of personal experience, we're going to have to sort of accept them all. But I think the people who want to believe will predispose themselves to genuinely and honestly in their minds accepting something, meaning that they are not ready or willing to challenge that belief. They're not interested in asking the hard questions. They're not interested in really even knowing the real answer. It doesn't mean that it's not an honest belief, and that I just think it's often an unchallenged belief, and they have created sort of an environmental situation. They've created conditions where they are not challenged. It's the same reason my parents put us in a private Christian school, right? Leave them unchallenged, leave them completely untapped and untouched, make sure that everyone around them is loaded with confirmation bias. They will believe it honestly, and they'll want to believe because everybody around them believes it. And I think the two are congruous. I think the two do go hand in hand. I'll give the microphone back to the moderator. I want to say thank you guys for your time, for your attention. I realize there's a host of amazing people and perspectives, and we can all agree to disagree. We can all challenge each other. That's what we need to be doing, to make each other uncomfortable. And I thank you for the opportunity to sort of tell my story, and I wish you a wonderful and fulfilled, happy, long, and truthful life. Thank you so much.